I have my own notes is the refusal to face the dark forces, and that's a general kind of statement. It's to live in a utopian dream world. Unfortunately, it seems to me I often find that about young people who have watched too many cartoons on TV growing up. That's one of my own. I have no data for that, but I just have that feeling. I have a feeling that it creates some sort of an unrealistic world. I have a young man, that I have in mind that I just saw him growing up with that, and it just seemed like always faded off, and it's refusal to face reality. I guess I've used this example before, but if I was playing ball with him, he wanted me to throw the ball real high, and he's going to make this spectacular catch. And that's how he wanted me to play catch with him. And I said, no, let's start out this far apart because he couldn't catch him. I mean, I threw him high. He had this idea he was going to make this spectacular catch, and then that was going to, I guess, win my praise or something. But, my idea was, well, no, we start out here throwing the ball another two, get very secure catching the ball at that distance, and then we'll move back and get very secure and you keep going, and each time you get good at it. That's the realistic way to learn how to catch the ball. But he didn't want to do that. And I saw it as symptomatic of a whole approach to life. And I mean, I think you can extend it. It's not just catching a baseball that's a lot along that line, but it can be, an own growth in the spiritual life, and we want to sort of jump from here to there, and we're going to be great without through the steps along the way. Part of the utopia that affects us is going to be prayer without really working at basis of step prayer methodology that are available. You see in the outlook often you see that in relationships. I sit in a room and talk to many young people get married. You can set sort of outcome forth. It's all going to work automatically and easily without great effort. So you can multiply where this utopian outlook takes over. Finally, refusal to talk about sin and guilt, something that sort of Fox is accused of in this whole line of ancient spirituality, that they don't seriously the fact that you're threatened sin and guilt. I want to talk about it, and it's a downer, and it pulls you down and gives you bad thinking. So it's been a lot of effort to get rid of it. We've seen it in this education circles and a lot of preaching where priests and ministers don't feel comfortable more talking about sin, and they catch negative vibrations from people if they want to bring it up, and people interpret it as somehow undercutting the positive message of the Scriptures. So there's a strong movement in Catholic circles since the Second Vatican Council to, as I like to say, put sin and guilt talk into its own silence. And I think that just intensifies the problem, as you might see it. I think what we need here is a good sense and better descriptions of the problem of where we don't handle the darkness well. And I'd like to invite the one-to-one conversation, and after that I'm going to invite anyone to share other examples of where we don't deal well with the dark forces. I'd invite you to find another partner again, and just we're going to do this for a couple minutes. What are the dark forces for yourself, or that you see operative in the culture, and what are some of the poor ways of handling them?
Immediately get riled up, but then they equally get riled up by the feminists and just call them quote unquote, oh well, don't worry about them, they're just a bunch of lesbians that don't have their sex act together, and that's why they're all together. And I mean, that's really, it really is a destructive point of view that they are portraying. Now I don't know, it's gotten
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example of it, and I'll see it at work in society as well. See it at work in church. There's no group more involved in the church than the gay community by Vatican document. We'll talk about gays being an essential border, and that hurts them a deal. So, I mean, people have asked us about the response to the gay community. I'm sure a lot of that is exacerbated by these crisis and so on, and the lottery that goes with that. And as we want to see here, we find ways to deal more constructively with such phenomena. But yeah, it's a perfect example of what we're talking about. And we're not going to make any progress as long as people, just react defensively and in negative ways to people who are different. And one of the questions that one would want to ask, I mean, it seems to me if one ever wanted to pursue the conversation and it made sense to do so, is, well, what do you really think about those people, and what is your big problem, and try to ferret out some of the underlying emotions that go with the negative response. If one is in serious conversation, I would think that would be one thing one way to go about it. But, we know with all those things we're in long-range educational projects, aren't we? We're with so many of our large social problems. We have to find a way to help the next generation to be more open and so on. But it is a good example. I'm going to, let's see, was there another comment?
One of the ways we've kind of done away with many of our problems, especially in facing problems that we have in our schools with drugs and alcohol abuse, by simply refusing to acknowledge that there is a problem. And we do that with in my own life. I know sometimes I say, well, it's not a problem, and I try to push it away and don't deal with it, and that makes it grow.
Sure. No, that's a good example. So many problems, social problems we haven't faced. I mean, take the environmental crisis. I mean, can a candidate really get up and tell us what the problems are, the environment and how we're going to respond to them? It's hard to get honest dialogue on the great questions like that. And we see the destructive character of closing them off. And what we need, of course, is, to springboard this thing is a theology, a perspective that's going to encompass that. That becomes one of the most important things. I think I'm going to go ahead and do that. Move into trying to offer the theological perspective on this. And I start out with going along with this idea of an original blessing. God makes the world, He looks down and it's good, He makes the humans, they're very good. But the story goes on. And the story includes the story of the two people in the garden who are tempted by the serpent and are told that if you eat of the fruit of this tree, then you will be like God and know all things. And they succumb to that. And as a result of succumbing to that temptation, as the biblical story tells us, bad things happen. The world gets messed up in one way or another. And work gets out of line. And Cain enters into the world. And then the stories go on. In Genesis, now Cain and Abel. Now we got siblings not able to get along. And destructive behavior occurring as a result of this. Now we've got the Tower of Babel story. The Tower of Babel story tells us that people as groups begin to ally themselves against one another rather than working in harmony. Now they don't understand one another. There's a lack of communication that's going on in the world. And we get Noah and the flood story, that people really, it gets so bad there has to be a purging that goes on. So the Bible, clearly, whatever any commentator says about it, if you carry the story through, the original beauty of the plan got messed up to begin with. And we have a name for that in the tradition. We call it original sin. So it's alongside of original blessing, we find original sin, which is a permanent and universal character of the human condition. So it creates a situation in the Bible and in our understanding of things where is as the evolutionary process moves forward, as the history goes on, that there are like two contending forces, original blessing and original sin, grace and disordered existence. They are sort of in contention throughout history. We can see that played out in the biblical world, so that God frees the people from Egypt. A very telling story, and they get out, they get freedom. Wow, this is great. God wants to liberate people. But when they get out, they can't handle the freedom. Now it's too much, and they get tempted. They say, well, at least back there we had enough to eat. Out here we don't have anything to eat. This freedom's scary. What are we going to do? Back there was an ordered existence. So there's a temptation to flee back to enslavement. Again, a very telling commentary on the human scene, that part of the dark force is that not able to deal with our opportunities, with our freedom. That's part of the modern world. We got all these options. We got so many things we could choose to do. And it gets frightening very often. And people say, get me back to security, get me back where someone's going to tell me what to do. We find that phenomenon in the church. It's too scary and all. Some people are saying, well, you need the authority. Tell us what to do, how to live. So, the biblical story is filled with this contention between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. However, we get to the story of Jesus, and we see certain elements of the story. We see some way of interpreting this constant battle between the forces of good and evil. Very important. What the story of Jesus finally will tell us is that the forces of good are always more powerful than the forces of evil. They're going to win out. In the long run, the light is more powerful than the darkness. The light shines in the darkness. Darkness doesn't grasp it or understand it, but the light will win out. That becomes the positive message that we see in the story of Jesus, but not until he goes through it. You know, right from the beginning, in the infancy accounts, you see this marvelous contention again. And take the story of Herod, for example. Herod represents all the dark forces out to get the child. And here's the God's working star and wise men from the east and God guiding and everything. But here's Herod trying to mess it all up. He's in the mix right from the beginning. We'll have let's do the questions after the analysis here. Okay, well, let's see where it goes and see how it comes out. So we got this contention. Herod representing, symbolizing the evil forces in the world, and then and we've got God again, the powerful force coming to save him, gets him out of there, takes him to Egypt. And then we look at the life of Jesus himself, and we see how all of that becomes very real in his life. So he has to face the fact that people don't understand him. His disciples don't really see what he's all about. We got the temptations of Jesus, where the Satan figure comes and tries to mess up his vision of what he's all about. Christ commits himself to the cause, and in committing himself to the cause, a lot of other problems evolve, because the religious leaders don't understand it, and they're against him, and Herod thinks he's a fool, and his own religious leaders think that he's a blasphemer, and Pilate thinks he's a political revolutionary. So by grabbing hold of the cause and living life with zest and energy and committing himself to the cause, it seems to bring forth almost the powers of evil that are worked in the world. And so finally this takes him to the agony in the garden. But it's so taken with that story of the agony in the garden and how you see the epitome of all of this. Some people have heard me talk about this before, but I've had many times in counseling lately, I've had where it just seems as though the story of the agony in the garden comes up, and it strikes me as so poignant and often the kind of thing that people need to wrestle with when they're trying to handle the dark forces. Because we see Jesus in the agony in the garden assailed by those things. You even see his own temptation to escape from it. You see his own feeling that, Father, if possible, don't make me do this. Possible, I don't want to do this. He wants to get out of this. And yet finally there's in your, that not my will but thine be done. Agony in the Garden, a poignant story. It comes to my mind, and again, I've said it before, but a great peacemaker in our community, Chuck Benedetti, and I used to talk about the spiritual life, and we used to talk a lot about the agony in the garden. I don't know exactly why that came up, but that was a point of reference about the struggles of life and what that all meant. And then one day I received a phone call that said he was in the hospital and had been diagnosed as having a brain tumor. And I went to the hospital and I got there and I was overwhelmed with emotion and so on. And I went in and wanted to pray for him or talk to him, and I couldn't do it. I just sobbed. And Chuck reached over, put his arm around me. He says, "Remember the agony in the garden." All the things we had talked about. It was his way of placing the struggle with the dark forces, which in this case was his own brain tumor and impending death that would cut short the career of a man who just did finishing a book on the peace movement and had a $80,000 grant to do an oral history of the Vietnam War period that would have been very important in the peace movement and all of that, and all these remarkable things that just cut short his response. Remember the agony in the garden, which is the feeling of the struggle of the dark forces that end up assailing us. And then I was just repeating that to somebody the other day of the way I think it illuminates much of the struggle that we're talking about. So Jesus eventually then, continues to struggle this, and then we come to the cross, and that's really the whole import of this befriending the darkness of Matthew Fox, is to talk about a theology of the cross, because the cross ends up epitomizing the struggles of Jesus. And so on the cross, Christ forgives those who have offended him or are executing him, and he ends up saying, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" A great moment of absence of God. There's real darkness. That's one we didn't get into our mix before. It's the strong experience of the absence of God in prayer and in our lives. And then, the Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. The moment that leads to his own victory that we call the resurrection. So when we just look at the life of Jesus, the power of the darkness is so immense and overwhelming and so on. And yet, there's where we get the answer to the contention throughout history. Because what the story says, and the meaning of the resurrection, is that those dark forces cannot finally triumph. That there's a stronger force at the world. And naturally, you get back to what Pat asked before about trusting life. The eventual trusting of life seems to me for Christians to be based on the way Jesus both lived life and interpreted it. The way he understood his own process, where he knew the temptation to escape and yet stayed with it. That whole idea of he went to Jerusalem. Could have stayed up north and he wouldn't have got killed up there. They might not have liked him, but they weren't going to execute him up there. The only place he could really get executed would be in the capital city if he goes to Jerusalem. And that's what he does. He sets his face on Jerusalem and goes there. So this becomes, Christ, his own model, and then finally his resurrection becomes the guarantee that indeed life is trustworthy, that the dark forces, real as they are, and in contention as they are with the goodness, really cannot have the final word. And then we got, just to play that out a little bit, in the Paul, there's an interesting sequence of Paul when he goes out to preach, and he gets to Athens. And in Athens, he decides to use a clever methodology. He goes in to the open air. They've got a lot of gods to worship, and there's an altar there, the unknown God. He walks in and says, "Well, I know who that is, that unknown God." And a very clever boy. And then he goes on to finish up his sermon and says about the unknown God being presented by Jesus, who's been raised to life. The Athenian response, Paul, is, "We'll hear you again on this." And Paul, at that moment, at his heart, he says, "Well, that's it." He says, "Now on, I preach to Christ and Him crucified." He goes to Corinth and has remarkable success there. He preaches Jesus Christ, Him crucified. begins to see the centrality of the cross, and Paul becomes one of the major figures in this whole effort to understand the meaning of Jesus and to spread the good news throughout the world. Now, there's a theology that I think is so important. All of that reveals something about God. This theology of the cross tells us something about God. And it comes to me in this way, that whatever we think about God, it has to be broad enough to encompass the dark forces of life, to encompass the tragic dimension of life. Whatever we think about God, if it excludes that, it won't work. And again, I've used this example, but take an example of a woman who went through a divorce. It's very painful. The divorce is absurd. She didn't want the divorce, didn't want it to happen, and she's very upset about it and so on. Now, her idea of God is one in which says that, well, if you try in your marriage to make it work and you live a good life, it ought to work. So that's her idea of God. God is one who rewards good people, and God rewards effort, and God makes sure it comes out all right if you just do the right thing. So she's sitting there, unable to cope with the divorce because her framework is too narrow, because her idea of God is too circumscribed to include the dark side. The biblical story is very different from that. It's not like there's God in this world of the kingdom here, and outside here are these absurd forces somehow that make no sense. But in the Bible, the God is so big and so powerful that he encompasses the whole of it, so that he can take even the darkness and make it be part of an overall positive victory of the light. He can even take the absurdity of the cross and turn it into the final victory for humankind, and a guarantee that indeed the human family will be reunited in heaven one day. But you see, the Bible gives a picture of God that is not just a smiling Santa Claus or a kindly grandfather, but this is a God who has encompassed within the overall plan even the darkest of the forces that work in the world. And therefore they can't finally win out. That's how I see the miracles of Jesus. Miracles of Jesus finally show that no matter how the demons have taken you over, even, habited the people, Jesus can cast them out. So that's the theological perspective that I would offer on dealing here with the dark forces. I'm not saying as well as I'd like the practical aspect of that, but I'm convinced that I've sat with many people and said, you're never going to get out of that problem, you're never going to overcome, rise above that tragedy in your life, the death of your child, the breakup of your marriage, the illness that you face, and so on, if the image of God will not encompass that, if it's not big enough to fit into that piece. Like Job. Job is a good man. He did everything right. And he's contending with God. Why is this happening to me? Weigh my cause in the balance, Job said. He's and his friends, they got to say, well, you must have done something wrong. That's why this is all screwed up for you. The image of God is too narrow. And how does God respond? God says, where were you when I made the earth? Do you know how I set it all up? Do you know where I store the snow? That's the answer of God to Job. What it effectively does, the story, very poetic, powerful story, effectively challenges the narrow image of God. What it's saying to Job is, your conception of who I am is too small. Your limited, finite brain's got it figured out this much of how it all works. But it doesn't work like that. I'm not telling you how it works. I'm just telling you it's too narrow. It's too circumscribed. Without it, you can't make sense out of your life. And Job's response is a faith statement. He accepts this from God. He kneels in adoration before the God who's bigger than his ideals. So that's the theological perspective, it seems to me. The dark forces can be managed, and only if they're somehow seen within a large enough theological frame. And And we have to ask ourselves is where does it narrow for me so that the God can't fit in there? Let's our one-to-one discussion again, and then we'll have some questions, and we'll have a practical applications, and then we'll have time for you to process all of this. Once you find a partner and see why don't we see if we have questions or comments out of that section? Very important question or the observation that Des makes here, I wonder, which is fundamentally, I mean, if God loves me, and why is he not helping me? Like, why is he using me as part of the evolutionary process in a negative way? Fundamentally, it's the question that we wrestle all the way through history with, is trying to look at a God who is both all-loving and all-powerful. If you see it in those terms, you got it. It's hard to figure out. If he's all loving and he's all powerful, then why does he let us suffer like that? And if you can somehow encompass that in your framework, you can say, well, I've got, a baby who cries for 2 years after his first born. Why do I have to go through that? It was a year and a half. Why do I have to go through that? But you can sort of say, well, okay, we'll come out of that. And if someone else has got their baby asleep through the night, okay. But the problem comes in when the evil is massive. When the evil is monstrous, like the Holocaust, like starvation, that's where it goes wrong. And you really have, throughout history, got two sort of choices. You can emphasize one or the other side, that God's all loving, and all the words you use, tender, compassionate, merciful, or God is all powerful. Now, I would say that the way I would like to see it is to play off the all goodness of God, the loving character of God, that God's with us and is always on our side, always fighting against evil, always trying to help us to make the world better. God's against all of the enslaving systems. God's against greed and war, and God wants to overcome them, and is constantly in making the effort to overcome them. But what is played down in this image is God's power. God's power is rethought. God can't do whatever God wants. God is limited by his own creation. Two major factors in his creation that limit God. One, the material evolving world that we have, and secondly, human freedom. And our idea is that God will not interfere with that creation. I mean, when the world, when the underpinnings of the world move, and so we get earthquakes. And God won't stop that because that's part of the world that he created and is evolving. And God doesn't stop greed and selfishness that lead to wars and unjust systems because he leaves us free. So the image of God that emerges out of all of that, and I think it's especially triggered by the massive evil that we've come to know more about in the 20th century, the Holocaust, starvation, and so on, is to play up the loving character of God. And God is not testing us. God's not allowing this evil. God's fighting against it. God's trying to overcome this evil, working every way to overcome it, but God is blocked by the realities of the world that he's created and won't interfere in. So that the world is going to have earthquakes and floods and hurricanes, and some people are going to misuse their freedom. The only alternative seems to be that God creates robots.
people are always good. Programs are good. Like we put a bunch of us down here, a couple million people, and program is like a computer that we would always do the right thing. The problem with that, I mean, if you try to understand why that might be, and this almost gets too blurry to speculate, but you could imagine a God wanting a loving response and not just wanting robots running. I mean, you would say, why did he make a world that was perfect? Well, he would have had to make robots. Automatons. You couldn't make people with freedom. Because as soon as you got freedom, you got people who lose freedom. It's very obvious. You got a choice. You choose evil. Good. So that would be, there are no good speculative answers to the problem of evil, but that is one framework that really makes sense. It's the framework that the rabbi used in when bad things happen to good people. It's the same fundamental framework that as love is played off and power is played down, or at least power is relative. So then you're able to say that God is on your side. That God is on the forces of liberty side, the forces of liberation. God is working to make the world better. He's just blocked and defeated, but eventually he will win out. That becomes our great hope. Eventually God wins. But it's a good example of how we have to struggle with the idea of faith. I mean the idea of the image of God. It's a perfect example. Your image of God won't encompass the Holocaust or the Ethiopian situation. I mean, there's no way to do it. It won't encompass the tragedy of the divorce. There's nothing. You can't cope with it. You got to have a perspective that's big enough to place the tragic element. You must comprehend tragedy. Otherwise, you can't function. You can't rise above tragedy. So no, Jesus didn't give us a speculative answer. What he gave us was an answer of how you're supposed to do it. My teacher, Carl Arnold, said, don't waste all your time thinking, the world screwed up. Put your effort in how you're going to cope with it and how you'll the wise, prudent to do. Put your effort in now and not then. I think it's let me complete my page and then we'll take our longer and proceed with the process. So our practical way of dealing with all of this. Fox's point is befriend the darkness. Befriend the darkness. That's what you have to do. Now, does that mean befriend the darkness? Well, I can start out by saying I'm not sure. So let me try to say some of the things that Fox says or that other people say that it seems on target. Instead of railing against the absence of God in prayer, what one would do is just sort of say, well, God's absent, but I'm going to keep praying. In other words, it wouldn't become a major deal, like, where are you? Why aren't you real to me? It would be like, that's embracing the darkness, is just to say, okay, I'm in a fallow period, and have been for 2.5 years. I mean, no consolation in prayer, but big deal. I'm going to keep praying. Embrace the darkness. Be able to laugh at ourselves so that we don't take ourselves with ultimate seriousness. So that we embrace our foibles, embrace what's messed up about us. Accept the fact that we don't have it all together. Accept the fact that there's things about my personality, my history that are rough or abrasive, out of whack. Laugh at ourselves. Meet the unknown courageously. The unknown is a big part of it. So what we were trying to do is to gather our forces, suck in our guts, and carry on. Try to pick up the cross and take it. And instead of just always complaining about it, there would be a certain strength in it. This is my lot, and right now, and I have to take it on. I embrace it by carrying that cross and not complaining about it, and not thinking my lot's worse than anybody else. It's a story of that the Buddha tells about the woman who's baby died. She couldn't stand it. And she just couldn't admit the baby was dead, so she brought the baby to the Buddha and said, well, make him better. And the Buddha said, fine, yeah, well, we need a potion. So you got to go get this potion, make the baby better. So he said, here's the ingredients you need. So he gave her the ingredients. He said, you go to the house and get the ingredients. And wherever, but you can't get the ingredients from any house where they've had tragedy or suffering. So she goes to the first house, they got the ingredients, that's good, they gotta have them, but if you had any tragedy, yes, our daughter died. So he goes to all these houses, and one after another, same thing happens. He comes back to the Buddha, and hands the Buddha the baby, and says, I'm ready to bury the baby. This is embracing the darkness, I think, this Fox is talking about, is to accept the reality here, and to realize there's no easy sort of escape. Face the negative emotions. To embrace the darkness means that we don't get bent out of shape because that we have jealous thoughts or weird sexual fantasies or angers that seem to be inappropriate. That we don't just think that we're terrible or strange or out of it or a bad person. So we
Can't even face that. To befriend the darkness means that we would be more at ease with that and say, okay, so what? Get on with it in a sense. And finally, it would mean to face death, maybe even to see death as an adventure. I know a person who talks about it like that, who sees death as sort of exciting, like, wow, that's quite an experience. I wonder what it's like. And I'm sort of, I'll be ready to do it. When my time comes, I'll be ready to see what it's like. What does it mean to die? And what do you go through? And it's a sort of adventuresome. Now, when this person talks like this, I don't know if I, accept it on face value or not. It's so foreign to my own experience, I don't know what to make of that. But I take it that that's part of what one would mean by befriending the darkness of death. So that one wouldn't be just only scared of it or worried about it, but one would see a positive side to it. Boy, this is interesting. My mother, the great theologian, says in a comment on this, there must be something better than this life. That's her way of analyzing the death process. Got to be something better than this. And that sets up the adventure. Let's find out what that is. This whole side of things I learned from my mother. Whatever I know about it, I learned from my mother. Whatever this means, befriend the darkness, she knows a lot about it. I said she was in that very situation when she had 2 healthy children, and she thought the world owed her a living, as she said, that the world, everything was beautiful and great, and it would all sail along smoothly, and the 3rd child was born with RH factor, brain effectively destroyed at birth, and there she was. What do you do with that? Didn't fit any of her notions of God. Didn't fit. It makes sense. There was no way to put it in the framework. So my mother, contrary to what many people do, enlarged her framework. The other way is you walk around mad about it the rest of your life, and upset and unable to function and so on. So what her response was just the opposite of that. She enlarged her framework so that that fit into there. So that there was now a way to work it. So she had to take care of this youngster, and she did for 7 years. Couldn't move or had to be held and head held and everything. Did all of that, carried that on. So that what she learned was that whatever the realities of life are, that's what you have to accept. You have to deal with life on its terms. So befriending the darkness means that you accept life along that line, as opposed to railing against it. And let me tell you an example of people I see that don't do that, and there's a subtle trap. And that is, again, on this divorce situation. Someone gets a divorce, they don't want it, they didn't want it, they tried to make the marriage work, and they were treated unfairly, and the spouse involved, wouldn't work at it. So they never got a chance. They never had a chance to work at it. That's unfair. Why didn't we at least talk about it, go to a counselor, try to work it out? I never had that chance. Now, what does one do about all of that? Well, there's one thing, it's a phenomenon I see that happens in that. It's something like this. The person said, I'm never going to be happy again. I'm never going to be at ease with this. I'll never accept this, because if I did, it would be like saying what he did to me was okay. Now, I think you can begin to see the trap. There's no way out as long as you're there. There's no way out. All you can do, you must maintain this bad feeling. You must maintain your down, negative outlook, because it's the only way to protest the unfairness of what has happened. Because as soon as you would let go and be happy again and free of it and at ease again, you'd be like saying, well, it was okay what he did. That was all right. So the person is in a trap. Just, there's no way out. You got to walk around being miserable the rest of your life as an ongoing protest against what has happened. Now, what I'm saying is there is a way out. The way out is found in the theological framework that I suggested. And the way out is that this person has to let go of that. It's the kind of point about beauty that was made before. The objective sinfulness involved in the relationship and the breakup is there. It's encompassed in the whole divine plan, the whole way that reality is collected in whatever this is that we mean by God. It's there. She doesn't have to maintain her mad forever in order to protest this infidelity and this lack of commitment and so on. But I say it in order to show the subtleties of how we can get trapped in feeling bad. We got to feel bad, got to be down on ourselves or the world or somebody, because it's the only way that one is somehow faithful. The only way to be faithful. And what Matthew Fox is saying is that there's something else we need to do. So the first thing is befriend the darkness. That I'll maybe play that out a little more in other ways. Second point is that we have to avoid mortification.
Turn the tape over.